There has been a lot of discussion recently surrounding Deltarune's newer chapters, especially when it comes to the mystery of the Shadow Crystals and who might be responsible for giving them out. Many people have pointed toward characters like Gaster or other hidden figures that the game has yet to fully reveal. While I understand why those theories exist and even agree that some of their points are compelling, I personally do not think they align with what Deltarune is presenting. Up to now, Deltarune's narrative shows that it's written as a character-driven story that hides its biggest truth beneath small, consistent details rather than big reveals. Instead of constantly introducing new disconnected mysteries, it builds on the same core ideas of freedom and control through reoccurring characters and subtle dialogue, and even by the story itself, letting patterns from naturally over time be relevant. The game avoids overcomplicating itself with random twists and instead expands outward from what's already been established, meaning that even its strangest elements usually tie back into the main story rather than existing separately. Rather than relying on speculation on that stretches beyond what we are shown, I believe it is more important to focus on the narrative that already exists within the game itself. For a long time, the fandom, including myself, fell into the rabbit hole of analyzing chapters 1 and 2 as if they were following a kind of formula, almost like each chapter was its own contained story with a similar structure. There's a new dark world, a new antagonist, and a new secret boss, and because of that, it became easy to assume that the game would continue in the same pattern, leading people to theorize in a way that treated each chapter as separate rather than connected. But looking at it now, the interpretation doesn't fully hold up. The similarities between each early chapters were supposed to be the laying foundation. What Deltarune is actually doing is building slow, where each chapter acts as a continuation of the last, not a replacement for it. Events that seem isolated at first is gradually a part of a larger ongoing story that's gradually unfolding. Each chapter isn't a different story, it's a new piece of the same story, continuing from the other. It's almost as if it's like a cliffhanger, right? The biggest reason it likely isn't Gaster or Friend comes down to how Deltarune chooses to tell its story. Characters like WD Gaster or Theorized Friend exist mostly in the background. They're abstract, hidden, and barely acknowledged within the actual forward-moving narrative. Deltarune, however, consistently builds a story through active present characters who directly influence events we can see and follow. The shadow crystals are not just vague mysteries, they are tied to a specific character arcs, and repeated themes of freedom. Because of that, the person responsible for them needs to be someone embedded in the story structure, not someone who exists outside of it. If Gaster or Friend were the ones distributing shadow crystals, it would shift the narrative into something much more detached and meta-focused. They tend to rely on stretching small, vague details into major conclusions, and while that kind of theorizing can be fun, it doesn't fully line up with how Deltarune has been presenting its narrative. So far, the story has actually been more clear and intentional rather than cryptic. These crystals are not any normal item in the game. They are directly tied to characters who have experienced a form of awakening of some sorts, gaining awareness of something beyond their reality while simultaneously losing their sense of stability. This pattern is most clearly seen through characters like Jebel and Spamton. Before their encounters with whatever influenced them, both characters lived relatively normal lives within their roles. Jebel was simply a jester, while Spamton was an ambitious but ordinary salesman. However, after interacting with a mysterious presence, both characters gained knowledge that fundamentally changed their perception of the world. Jebel began to see everything as meaningless and claiming that he alone was the only free one, while Spamton became obsessed with the idea of being controlled, desperately trying to break free from his strings. In both cases, the newfound awareness led not to true freedom, but to instability and madness. This strongly suggests that the shadow crystals are not just symbolic, but are instead tied to a form of forbidden knowledge, something that reveals the truth of the world in a way that the characters aren't able to handle. People like to believe that this is a meta knowledge that makes them aware of being a part of Deltarune's game. But I do sincerely believe whoever is doing this knows more beyond the game itself. Both Jevil and Spamton also reference the existence of an unknown figure who influenced them. Jevil speaks of meeting someone who showed him the truth, while Spamton's story involves mysterious interactions that ultimately led to his downfall. Spamton descends into insanity, and his connection to the Shadow Crystal follows contact with how he used to call someone on the phone that would help his path to success, guiding him and feeding him the right choices. When that connection cut them off, Spamton completely collapsed, both mentally and socially, leading to his erratic, broken behavior. Even if it's been suggested that Tenna played a role in cutting that connection, there's still the clear implication that someone or something was speaking to Spamton after they were cut off. Even if it was implied to be just static, that voice is what likely exposed him into the kind of forbidden awareness tied to shadow crystals. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I genuinely believe these characters serve a much bigger role than just being optional secret bosses you can fight and move on from. A lot of people, at one point, tend to look at these characters like Spamton and Jevil are side content. Tragic, interesting, but ultimately disconnected from the main story outside of reinforcing its themes. They're often treated almost like the Goners from Undertale, mysterious figures that exist more for lore flavor than actual narrative progression, which is why so many people immediately try to tie them to WD Gaster. And yeah, I get why, on the surface, they feel hidden and cryptic and detached, but then you have figures like Gerson Boom, who further blur the line entirely. He plays a major supporting role in shaping characters like Susie, helping her grow and embrace her own agency, while also trying to tie the same deeper themes surrounding freedom and strength. When characters like this are placed alongside so-called secret bosses, it becomes clear that the game isn't separating into the main story and side content, the way players assume. It's presenting one cohesive narrative, where some pieces are simply harder to access than others. And that's the point. These characters aren't just here to have tragic backstories or reinforced themes. They are actively participants into the story structure, showing the consequences of the same forces driving the main plot. The only reason why they feel optional is because the game doesn't force you to confront them, but if anything, that design choice actually makes them more important, not less, because engaging with them expands your understanding of what's really happening beneath the surface. It changes how you approach the mystery entirely. And because of that, the answer isn't going to come from outside the story, it's going to come from the very structure that the story has been guiding us through this entire time. Which is why I think, in the end of all of this, with all the characters and culprits there can only be one character from all of them that has truly proven who it actually will be. The Roaring Knight. She has already established a central antagonist who operates in secrecy and directly affects the structure of the world. Instead of introducing a completely separate entity to explain these events, it makes far more narrative sense that the same figure who is responsible for creating dark fountains is also responsible for spreading the knowledge that destabilizes these characters. The action of the Knight further reinforces this idea. By creating dark fountains, the Knight is actively disrupting the balance between light and dark, pushing the world closer to the Roaring. This is not passive or accidental, but a deliberate attempt to break the rules that govern reality. In this sense, the Knight embodies the same desire for freedom that is seen in the secret bosses, but on a much larger and more controlled scale. While characters like Jevil and Spamton are driven from madness by their awareness, the Knight appears to act with purpose, suggesting a deeper understanding of the world and its limitations. The connection between the Knight and the Shadow Crystals becomes even more significant when considering how these crystals function within the game. Each secret boss leaves behind a shadow crystal. More importantly, the knight themselves is shown to be directly connected to these crystals, particularly in the moment where one is obtained following their encounter. While it could be dismissed as a simple reward and tied to how the knight is also somehow a victim, the fact that the crystal is also tied to the knight's weapon when a shadow crystal is dropped after fighting them suggests something much more meaningful. If the blade is an extension of the knight's power, then the presence of a shadow crystal implies that the knight is not merely carrying these objects, but there might be a chance that instead she is somehow producing or channeling them. This transforms the knight from a simple antagonist into something far more significant, a source of the very knowledge that defines the shadow crystals. This interpretation becomes even stronger when considering the possibility that the knight is connected to Death's holiday. Death is one of the most important characters that are missing from the game, constantly referenced but never seen. Based on how other characters describe her, she was bold, mischievous, and somewhat reckless yet still caring. I'd like to point out that the personality that's been given to us is very yet so similar to Susie, mirroring the same character in some way. I'm certainly following the idea that instead of successfully breaking free, she may have been consumed by something greater, becoming a vessel for the very force she once embodied. If the knight is indeed Death, then the ability to produce shadow crystals takes on an entirely new meaning. Rather than intentionally distributing them as tools, the knight may simply be expressing what they have become. The crystals could represent fragments of the truth that the knight has been exposed to, spreading outward and affecting others in the same way. This would explain why characters who come into contact with them experience similar transformations, gaining awareness but losing stability. In this sense, the knight is not just giving out knowledge, but is acting as a conduit for it, whether by choice or not. Now, I do want to make something clear about where this part of the theory is coming from. Specifically, when you access the S room in the area, you're able to play a forbidden version of the game that Eram kept, something that Tenna originally scrapped from the main show. As you continue through this hidden sequence and reach its conclusion, we get to see the shelter itself. This is the same shelter that has already been established in Deltarune as the place Chris is deeply afraid of. When trying to approach it in the game, Chris actively resists the player, showing clear fear and hesitation. On top of that, it's heavily implied that Chris, Noel, and Des and Asriel used to spend time together in the forest, the same area where the shelter is located. When you start putting these details together, it becomes much easier to believe that Des's disappearance is directly connected to the shelter in some way, especially when we know that there's a dark fountain in there. Then, when you actually enter the shelter in the mini-game, the game introduces a completely new character. And personally, I believe this is Chapter 3's true secret boss, not the Knight. Even though the Knight is a major encounter, this character feels more in line with how the game introduces these hidden figures. Someone new, someone who exists slightly outside the normal flow of the story.
Chris, oh Chris, that's why you are searching for them, aren't you? The shadow crystals, the shadow mantle I'm holding. Do you honestly think it'll get you what you want? No. Part of you is just enjoying this, isn't it? The same part that enjoyed yesterday, knowing that you could say it wasn't really you. Oh, and don't make that sour face. I can see in the dark, you know? The question is, can you?
This dialogue is very important because of how directly and personally it speaks to Chris, while also carrying a tone that feels far from aware than it should be. When the character talks about the shadow crystal and taking the mantle, it immediately establishes that this isn't just some random encounter. It knows exactly what Chris is doing and what their goal is. That alone is strange because most characters in Deltarune don't acknowledge Chris's deeper intentions so openly. But what makes it even more unsettling is the way it continues on thinking if this really will get what they want. This shifts the tone from a simple awareness to mockery and psychological probing. The character isn't just observing Chris, it's teasing them, almost enjoying the idea that Chris might be lying to themselves. It even references past actions, the same part that enjoyed yesterday, which implies a level of awareness that goes beyond the immediate moment. This is the same kind of unsettling, playful cruelty we've seen before in other characters like Jevil, where he doesn't just fight you, he toys with you. Whether this character is the mantle or simply holding it, the design and presentation strongly suggests a deeper link. The shadow mantle isn't just a reward, it's required to survive against the knight later on. Without it, you're forced to lose the fight. That alone gives its narrative weight, but pairing it with a character that behaves like this, and almost entertained by a struggle, makes it feel like more than just equipment. It feels like a piece of the same system the knight is a part of. And that's where the parallel becomes hard to ignore. The way this character is acting feels incredibly similar to how the knight presents herself. The knight doesn't just fight you, she plays with you, acting with a level of confidence that suggests she understands far more than she lets on. There's a shared energy here, both feel like they're above situation, like they're watching you to try to catch up to something they've already figured out. Even the line, "I can see you in the dark," the question, "can you," reinforces this idea. It positions the character as someone who is comfortable within the darkness. Because of that, even if we don't jump too hard to conclusions, there's clearly a symbolism here. The shadow mantle, and the entity tied to it, may represent a smaller contained version of the same force that the knight embodies. Like a mirror. It's not enough to fully define what it is yet, but it's undeniably connected. Taking all of this into account, the shadow mantle may not just be a reflection of the same darkness the knight embodies. It could represent the very force that overtook Des Holiday herself, now separated just enough to tease and to interact with Chris manipulatively. Because that's the key detail here, is that the knight, despite being the central cause to everything, doesn't really talk. If the knight is Des or something that has taken over her, then it's possible that what we're seeing here is a fragment of that darkness given a voice. The shadow mantle could be expressing the thoughts, awareness, or even the personality the knight herself doesn't openly show. That would explain why it feels so personal toward Chris, why it teases them and seems to understand their actions on a deeper level. I want to bring everything back to something that's been sitting in the background this entire time. Something that, after looking at this, feels way more important from what the dialogue Eram says. Because when you really look into what he's saying and how he's saying it, it starts to line up almost perfectly with something I've been wondering about for a while now. And it's about the song, "Don't Forget," the main motif of Deltarune. The song has always stood out, not just as the theme, but as something that feels like it means more than what it presents on the surface. And now, with the context of chapter 3 and 4, that meaning feels almost undeniable. "Don't Forget" isn't just some hopeful message to the player. It feels like it's telling us something directly about Chris, and more specifically, Chris's relationship with the knight, or even Des. And when you start connecting it back to Eram's dialogue, it gets kind of insane of how well it lines up. The song talks about how when the light is running low and the shadows start to grow, which on the surface sounds poetic, but looking at the story now, it almost sounds like a literal foreshadowing of the main conflict. The darkness is spreading and the world is being taken over. The balance between light and dark is collapsing. But what if it's not just about the world? What if it's about Des herself being taken over by that darkness? Because when you think about it, we already know that Des was implied to be a musician. So then you have to ask, what if "Don't Forget" isn't just background music? What if it's her song? Where else do we see something like this? "Raise Up Your Bat," a track tied directly to December when she's represented alongside Tenna. And then it clicks even further when you realize that "Don't Forget" isn't just its own isolated theme. It shares a musical motif with Lost Girl. That track, which is directly tied to Des, plays the same notes. It's not a coincidence. Don't Forget is literally connected to Dess's musical identity. And once you see that, it becomes really hard to ignore what the song is actually doing. It's not just representing a theme, it's representing her, which leads to something even more interesting. What if Don't Forget is a softer, more intimate version of the same musical identity, almost like a lullaby version of Raise Up Your Bat? Something quieter, more personal. And then, when you think about the voice, it's a female lead. And suddenly, the question becomes, what if that voice is Des? At the end of chapter 4, during the phone call when Chris is speaking with Carol, or possibly even the Knight, there's an implication that a promise is being made. Something that Chris has to continue. Don't forget, it's the same message, the same idea, the same reminder. And at that point, it stops feeling like a coincidence. It feels intentional. There's a part of chapter 4 that reinforces this even more though. One of the most subtle but most important scenes in the game is when Chris removes the soul and traps us. They go off to communicate privately, presumably with Carol and possibly the Knight as well. But while that conversation is happening, we're given the ability to move freely through the vents, which opens up an entirely different layer of information. If you choose to explore instead of listening in, you could peek into other parts of the house. And that's where we see Asgore. Asgore's situation in Deltarune is already pretty well established. He was formerly the police chief but was removed from his position after a major failure. Something the game keeps intentionally vague but heavily implies had serious consequences. Following that, he and Toriel got divorced and his life has been steadily falling apart ever since. He now runs a small flower shop that barely sustains him, and yet despite all of this, Carol still allows him to work under her, taking on jobs like cleaning the household in general. On the surface, it looks like a simple pity or generosity from the mayor, but this scene suggests there might be something more going on. Because when we observe Asgore through the vents, we catch him talking to himself. During this moment, he reveals something that completely shifts the perspective. He has a black shard. Now this is huge because that black shard in the light world is widely understood to be the equivalent of the shadow crystal in the dark world. This is a big reveal because suddenly we're asking the question immediately of why he has one, and more importantly, how did he get one? Asgore is not someone who explored dark worlds. He isn't involved in those events directly, and there's no indication that he would be capable of obtaining one on his own, which means that most logical conclusion here is that it was given to him. And if that's the case, then this lines up perfectly with everything we've been building toward. Because if Carol is connected to the Knight, but not the Knight herself, then it opens up the possibility that she is working alongside or in contact with the one who is distributing these shards. Whether she fully understands them or not is still unclear, and it also is uncertain how much Asgore himself knows about their true nature. But the existence of the shard in his possession proves that these objects are not confined to the dark world. They are being brought into the light world and passed between characters, and that changes everything. Because now, instead of the shadow crystals being isolated to the secret bosses or hidden encounters, we have direct evidence that their influence is spreading through the main cast, through characters like Asgore or under authority of Carol, who is seemingly in contact with the same forces tied to the Knight. There is simply too much evidence pointing toward the Holiday family being directly connected to the shadow crystals for it to be ignored. There was a lot I wanted to talk about and had so much more evidence, however, I decided to keep it snappy to give you guys more time to think about it yourself. Whether you believe me or not, all of this in the end of the day is just a theory. I could be wrong about it, but I wanted to give my take of what I thought made the most sense narratively. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts more in the comments on what you think. Other than that, I will see you guys next time, and remember everyone, to reach for the stars.